Hello, I'm going to start in a minute. I'll wait for maybe a couple more people will join us and then we'll start. Hi, Rachel. All right. Okay. So I'm I'm going to start. First of all, I've looked at the results of the quizzes. Some of you are doing really well, and I've looked at the results of people who were not doing as great, and it is clear to me by the way you're answering questions that you are not putting a lot of work into reading the textbook. So I invite you to try definitely quiz 3. There are still 2 attempts. It's very important that you try it. If you want to, before you try or after you did your first attempt, you're welcome to email one of us your notes to make sure that you're on the right track. Either Rachel, Juliana, or myself, just kind of like email and we will let you know how you're doing if you want to. For starting from chapter 4, you're going to have only one attempt, and for chapter 4, Juliana and Rachel will do a review with you. So we are going to email that to you in a week or so. All right, questions? No? Okay, wonderful. So chapter 3 that we're doing today and this week and next week also includes a module work. So I'm going to start by actually showing you what to do for the module work. So I'll go on Canvas, share screen, go to Canvas if I can. Show what you need to do. Okay, so we are in week 4 of this is Canvas. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so we're in week 4. So week 4 and week 5 this week and next week are the our chapter 3 kind of weeks. And on Canvas, here is what I have for you under required work. As usual, there's a PowerPoint, there's a summary of the chapter. There are key terms from chapter 3 that you need for your quizzes. There are a couple of videos here. Audience theory is probably the most important one. The female gaze is also important. I'm going to talk about that as well. Now, you also have module 3 to do, and it's due on March 8th. This is what you have here. So if you click on that, there is a very long prompt that includes everything. A little overview of what we're doing. We're talking about women and women representation in art and media. And then you have here everything that you need to read or watch to be successful in this module. So there's an article here, and then there are a couple popular sources. So this is an academic article that you need to read. This is the several popular sources. These are YouTube videos. And then there are questions. There are 5 questions in total. You're allowed to skip 2. So you have to answer 3 questions. Okay, so I'm expecting 3 questions. Each question should be about 200 to 300 words. Your response to each. So in total, you're going to have something like 600 to 900 words for your entire work. And here I have the rubric that we will be marking you with once you submit. Essentially, what I'm looking for is for you to show me that you've read, understood, and analyzed the material. The questions are specific to the material that I'm asking you to work on. They are the material, trust me, the material, the YouTube videos, and the kind of the articles are interesting and not complex. Um, and we're asking you to kind of to think about issues related to this particular that specific source. Okay, and that's that, and you do that, and you submit it by March 8th. Questions? No, so far so good. Okay. All right, so if you have questions, let me know. We are going to kind of to move on, and I will start talking about issues and PowerPoints, etc., related to chapter 3. Okay, so keeping. All right. Okay, so in chapter 3, we've got basically three different things that we're going to discuss. There is an issue of modernity, and then there is an issue of spectatorship, and gaze and power kind of in a way go together in some ways. Because we've got 2 weeks for this chapter, I'm going to concentrate on the first part of the PowerPoint today, and next Monday I will concentrate on the second part of the PowerPoint. So we are going to probably today look at mainly modernity and start talking about kind of the idea of the spectatorship theory. All right, so modernity. Modernity is historical period during which a broad set of economic and social structures took place. So your book starts modernity very roughly around Columbus's discovery conquest of Americas. This is one way of looking at modernity. There are other scholars and other books that start modernity at a later date, or some that start modernity at the earlier date. We are going to all together kind of decide that we're starting it at 1853. And I'm not going to belabor on the earlier kind of like the earlier part of modernity, until we get to the 19th century. So that kind of late Renaissance period and Enlightenment, we're not going to talk too much about. But the characteristics of modernity are very important because we still work and live in that period to an extent today. So modernity technically ended around 1965 as a period, but at the same time, we're still dealing, especially in terms of the race relations, colonization, etc. We're still dealing with remnants of modernity for sure. So modern period is characterized by secular humanism, which means that people become less religious and more believe in the powers of humanity, of the individual, of the kind of human brain. Emphasis on individualism, so less and less we see the power of the community, and more the emphasis on what individual person can achieve. Cultivation of economic growth, so you know the idea of the growing economy and making money becomes more and more important. and believe in progress of science and technology. So we believe more and more that science and technology can actually help us to be happier, live better, etc. So you can see how by 1965, some of these ideas at least become a little obsolete. Okay, so then early modernity is starts with again kind of conquest of Americas, but also conquest of Constantinople by an Ottoman Empire in 1453. And this is the period that we call early modern period. So early modern period is ends around French Revolution, and it is characterized by inventing of printing press and lessening of the religious influence. That's all you need to know. Early modernism, and we're moving to classical modernity. So classical modernity basically spans about around 19, like the whole 19th century, the whole 1800s. Starts with French Revolution in 1789, and kind of builds upon Enlightenment as well. So with that, we see kind of the encyclopedia, the creation of encyclopedia, desire to kind of to really define knowledge and also classify knowledge, believe in reason, birth of religious tolerance, kind of birth of telegraph as a first mean of quick communication. And from 1830s also photographic reproductions, photography, not reproductions yet, but photography, kind of the idea of mass producing images. And that spreads, that idea, these ideas spread around, and kind of they're all encompassing. Mostly kind of the idea of modernity really belongs to the Western civilization, but because of the increase travel and because of the like attempts and successful attempts, unfortunately, that colonize in so many countries, modernity and modern ideas become part and parcel of the existence of most of the countries, maybe with the exception of some parts of Asia and throughout the 19th century. We, however, are going to work on late modernity. So late modernity starts around 1870 and takes us to 1965. It's a culmination of colonial power, disintegration of colonialism later. So at first we have this kind of in the early 20th century, late 19th century, kind of all the powers. For example, England has such a huge empire, and then and it desperately tries to preserve all that, but by the early 20th century that empire starts kind of really fall apart, etc. um so what happens during kind of late modern period? The art, the literature, and the science progress very quickly, and there's an emphasis, national and international, on the developing of art, literature, science, etc. as well. So why is it so important for us? Because we have to understand that most of the media and most of the things that we are looking at were originated in that modern period. One of the things that I really want you to kind of to keep thinking today is that emphasis on the powers and the development of the individual. This idea that individual, not so much the community, but the individual has to be restrained, has to be educated, has to be kind of brainwashed, if you will, and make sure that that individual has kind of adequate development as well. Questions, comments before I'm skipping as usual quite a bit because we don't have time for all that, and I'm going to this is not directly related to the quiz, but I want to so I want you kind of just understand where we're coming from. So one of the most important thinkers, early thinkers of modernity is, of course, Rene Descartes. Sorry, I will come back to that, the other one. Rene Descartes. And he talks about the idea that how do we experience things? So it's not enough to experience world around us, he said. We need to be able to represent us, right? So that idea of the representation that we've talked about before becomes very important. So if we experience the world, our memory then grasps it, and then we have to represent it somehow. So Cartesian, from the word Descartes, understanding of the world emphasizes the power and centrality of individual. And if we think about that, then that individual would represent the world in their individual manner. It would not necessarily be the same. You represent something, or your memory represents something differently from mine. So the subject of individual is really the central figure of modernity. So that kind of our measuring stick. Whenever we think about like how do we understand something, we go back to that idea. How does individual take on something? So Descartes says we know the world by representing it in ideas, not by experiencing it empirically through our senses. So essentially, he takes away from our experiential understanding and think more about ideas. That's his main contribution for us, because he's paying attention to that idea of representation. So I'm going to then go and look at the next part that I want you to look at, and that would be kind of the idea of how do we make sense of what we see and why we enjoy media and shows so much. Before that, do you have any questions to me? Okay, so we've talked about modernity, and now I want to introduce you to this person who died in 1981, Jacques Lacan. Look at that cigar, that's crazy. So Jacques Lacan is philosopher and psychologist, psychoanalyst, I would say. And in many ways, he builds upon Freud and Freudian ideas, but in many ways, he does not. He takes them to a completely different level. So we know from probably from your studies of in high school potentially that with Freud there's a huge problem in his understanding of sex and gender. He essentially cannot fit women in his framework of sexual development. And when he fits them, then it just does not work. He does not have good understanding of how women develop. And so Jacques Lacan attempts to remedy that in many ways, and with and along among other things. He also takes away from the kind of Freud's emphasis on sexual development and looks more in at the development of the child's brain and understand overall experience. So he does not really become that preoccupied with the sexual development, but more so with just overall kind of emotional and physical and perceptual kind of that idealistic. Remember Descartes ideas. How do we develop just kind of overall ideas? So here is what I want you to think about. So this is Lacan, and now I want you to kind of step away from that And I want you to think about your favorite show or your favorite movie or something where that gives you so much joy when you watch that, that you are become completely mesmerized and you really don't want to go back and do your homework and do your university work or do your chores or anything like that, right? So something that kind of think about something that you really like to watch as a show. Now, we all have at least one, right? Anybody does not have even one show or film that would kind of be real exciting for them to watch? Okay, I'm not hearing anyone. Again, if you want to say something, unmute and talk. But I'm going to imagine that you all like some at least one thing. Okay, so then the question is, what is it about not that particular show, but what is it about us that makes us capable of being kind of enjoying and becoming part of that show to that extent? How come something that we see on the screen that doesn't necessarily tell us much about our life at all can actually capture us to such a huge extent? And Jacques Lacan, among other people, develops, to explain that, he developed something called spectatorship theory. So spectatorship, of course, kind of how we see things, how we make sense of things, spectator watching something, and kind of the theory. And in order to understand that, we have to kind of go back to when we were babies. So one of the things Jacques Lacan is talking about is called mirror stage. Jacques Lacan says this: when we are little babies, we depend on our caregivers, mother, father, whoever takes care of us when during the day. Usually we have like one main caregiver in, and remember, he bases his experience on the 20th century. Now we may have our experience may be a little slightly different, but nevertheless, let's just kind of think about that. So we have one particular caregiver, right? That person, mom, dad, that person carries us around, feeds us, makes sure we don't cry, hopefully puts us to bed. We kind of, when we wake up, they're there to pick us up, make sure everything is good, etc., etc. As a baby, you do not have understanding, or you do not have that capability of understanding that you are a different entity, a different person from your caregiver. It just feels nice to be next to someone, and it usually doesn't feel that great when you are separated. So that's why babies tend to cry a lot if they're away from their parents. Anyways, so that's kind of our first position. At some point, when we're maybe 18 months, 12 months, 18 months, maybe 24, like around there, we now start realizing that we are actually a separate being from our person who is kind of handling us, who's giving us care. Lacan calls it mirror stage because, in many ways, this is what helps us realize that is the mirror. We look at the mirror, we see that big person who is our caregiver, and we see that tiny person that is us, and we're kind of really surprised, like this little girl in the mirror, right? So that's the mirror stage. That's the stage when, and it may or may not have a mirror, like a physical object as part of that, but what happens is that we understand finally that we are separated, which means two things. it's really cool and exciting because we can do things apparently on our own. So we become toddlers, we walk around, we get into trouble, we do things that are unsafe, like touching plugs and everything else. But at the same time, so that's totally cool and exciting. But at the same time, we still want and crave that care and that warmth of the other body, and that also, and as we grow up, we get less and less of that very comfortable experience. Okay, so this is the summary of kind of what I've talked about, right? So Jacques Lacan, his mirror stage is about separation between infant and his mother or his caregiver. So they are separated. So then we have kind of, then as a result of that, once we understand that we're separated, we acquire a sense of self. I am my own self. Each of you, you're much older than what we discussed. We all know kind of who we are and our boundaries. The toddler tends to be over optimistic about his abilities. So remember, we, like, as toddlers, your parents may have talked to you about terrible twos, when you want to do everything by yourself and you run around and you constantly bump your head, fall, all these things. So as a result of that kind of independence, but also inability to be independent as a toddler, the result is the conflict between the actual subject, you, and the subject's sense of yourself, kind of you as you understand or think of yourself. You think of yourself as a 2-year-old, as a superwoman or superman who can do anything. But the life points out to the fact that you cannot reach the cookies, you cannot have ice cream anytime you want. And if you are playing with things that are dangerous, such as electricity or fire, you get hurt. So here we have that disconnect, right? So what happens when we watch something is that our mind goes back. So the spectatorship, the idea of the spectatorship. Do you have any questions before I continue on? No? Yes? Questions? Okay. All right. So how let's then connect that to the idea of spectatorship. So when we watch something that we intensely enjoy, we are abandoning that independent position and we become part of what is going on the screen. We become part of that. That mechanism is allowed by the experience and of the mirror stage. So we are constantly, as adults, as growing, children who are growing, we are constantly in part, at least, in search of that initial comfort. And when we look at something that we can empathize and identify with, we are going back to that point where we're very comforted. We really enjoy that. That's the spectatorship theory in a nutshell for you. So looking here is linked to know the idea of, if you watch a show, you watch TV, you also would be, if you are really deeply affected by it, you would also feel like you really know it, you really know the characters, right? The spectator, someone who is a spectator, is the subject position. It's someone who is the subject. And then spectatorship as well is kind of the condition of looking. Essentially, we're looking, and if we're looking for a long time, we become spectators. We're looking at something that is going on. We remain passive, we retain passive condition, right? Okay, so here in the slide 46, I have a video which also listed on Canvas on the mirror stage. So if you did not understand, because it's kind of it's somewhat complex, and I don't did not necessarily do total justice to that. This something like 7 to 10 minute video will teach you everything you need to know about mirror stage based on what I said. So again, do yourselves a favor before you take the quiz, watch that. Questions, comments before we go and talk about the gaze, because it's really connects us to the idea of the spectatorship. Okay, all right. So aside from modernity and the modernism that we talked about at the beginning, this whole chapter is about kind of like idea of looking, and the way it connects to modernity in terms of that idea of looking kind of is because modernity really allows for the spectacle to be created, and for also for kind of creation various differentials of power, and I'll explain that in a second. For now, instead of thinking about the spectatorship, we're going to think about the idea of the gaze. So the word gaze in English, you know English better than me. You can correct me if you'd like. But gaze is a look, kind of like a prolonged, sustained look. It's not a glance, because glance is very quick. It's not a kind of spectatorship, where you look for a very long time at something that is going on. But the gazing is longer than a glance, quicker than spectatorship, and it is very sustained and attentive look. It's not an examination of some of an because examination we usually reserve for something that is related to science. That's this is the word gaze. Okay, so at the very core, gaze, like kind of the idea of the gaze, not just gaze, but the gaze, that's kind of we use it in the media, is us checking out or looking at something that we find pleasurable or interesting or both, right? So here I've got for you painting Titian Venus of Urbina from 1538. You don't need to know anything about this painting necessarily. All I want you to do is to look at that. And I think you would agree with me that the painting is pretty. It's fun to look at. The important part, of course, of this painting is that we're looking at a very attractive woman who is nude, right? She's nude. She's represented nude. She's actually a very famous courtesan of that time, and we're looking at her, and she's letting us look at her. She's looking back, but the way she looks at us is that she's very aware that we're looking at her. Anybody disagrees? She doesn't mind us looking, and she kind of like her the way she looks back is she acquiesces. She says, yes, go ahead. I know I'm beautiful, and I know I'm lying here, so you can check me out. And we can have a discussion about to what extent this is appropriate or not appropriate. Definitely for 1538, even it was a little bit raunchy, and that's why Titian had to call her Venus. So she's the goddess of love. He couldn't just call her, see Donna so and so. He had to package that as a mythological subject. We can talk about objectification of women for sure, and that's what it is. That's why I'm bringing it up here, because the gays always have power relationship embedded in that. Unlike a look where, or glance where you just kind of like maybe note, maybe don't something. When we look at this painting, we are in the active position. She's passive. She allows us to look at her. But even if she didn't, like, even if she was looking at us very angrily, we could still look at her, but it wouldn't be as comfortable for us. Okay. So, what is a gaze? Gaze is um, looking that has relationship of power. So I always give students, when I talk about that, I always give students a very, very silly example. So you're on the main street in Geneseo, you're sitting at Crickets, and you're people watching. When you're people watching, you're not gazing. You're just kind of like you're watching people. But supposedly you see someone who attracts your attention, and you think they look really hot, or they look really attractive, or they look really interested, kind of interesting in terms of their fashion, or whatever it is. And you then, what you do is you gaze. You kind of stare, you essentially stare at them for a bit. Now, if you're outside or even inside and you're looking out and you're staring, there are two things that could happen. Well, maybe more, but basically two things that could happen. One thing is you're checking this person out. They're hot. They have no idea you're checking them out. They pass by. Then, in this case, they are they they are being gazed at. You are in a position of power. You check them out. You kind of took everything in. They just passed by being oblivious. If they're oblivious, nobody really suffered. But if it happens again and again, then that's kind of the power relationship that is embedded in that. The other thing that could happen is that person that you're staring at someone, and that person would stop, look back at you, and kind of and say something, or mime something, like, oh hi, thinking they know you, or why are you staring at me, or insert anything else you want. At which case, that relationship of the gaze is being interrupted, and there's a different relationship that will happen. So that person interrupted your, they reject the idea that they're the subject of the gaze, and they want to have agency. They want to have kind of a participation in that. Okay. Well, now understand, I'm not telling you not to check people out. That's not the point. You can do it in moderation and be very aware of that. The issue here is to understand that there is always power relationship between people when you do that. Questions, comments? So more often than not, gaze now, especially nowadays, is more of a field rather than just kind of one-to-one experience. So the fields of the gaze could happen in a museum, in theater, in the film. And the field of the gaze reflects kind of broader historical and social context. Okay, so then if we look at this, we have this individual type of gaze where you are a spectator, you are the viewer, and you are checking her out. But if you are in a museum somewhere or somewhere else, then you are looking at the painting, someone else may be looking at you, someone else would be looking at them, etc., etc. There are whole systems of kind of checking people out or understanding or showing off, etc., etc. So I'm going to stop here, and next time I want to kind of talk more about the gaze as a field and also connect that to a spectatorship theory. Okay, questions, comments. Next time I'll do we'll talk about Las Meninas next time and kind of look at that. Okay. If there are no questions, I will say goodbye. Feel free to stay and talk to me if you need to ask questions. Other than that, I will see you on Monday.